And we continue at 2:05 in the afternoon. Talk Radio 790 KABC, the John Phillips Show. Mr. Randy Wang's across the glass.
John, details are emerging about the divorce settlement with Antonio Villaraigosa and his now ex-wife. She gets a whole bunch of money, but she doesn't get to use his fake name.
Well, what's the point? No one can spell it.
He also gets to keep the Netflix account.
What shows do you think he's watching over there? Is it Cake?
I think he likes Love is Blind.
Could be. 800-222-5222 is the telephone number, 1-800-222-5222. It is a pleasure to welcome our next guest to the program. He is the national chairman of the Election Transparency Initiative, Ken Cuccinelli. Ken, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks so much for stopping by. So let's start out as someone who is a former attorney general in your state, which happens to be the state of Virginia. I'm sure you're familiar with many of the attorneys general all over the country, including one from the state of Florida that was just confirmed by the United States Senate to be the next attorney general of the United States of America, Pam Bondi. And oh boy, did she start out hitting the ground running by going after elected officials at the state and local level in New York for adopting sanctuary state policies that are not in line with what the federal government is asking them to do. What do you make of her performance so far, and what do you make of her taking aim at officials in New York that are thumbing their nose at the feds?
So I will tell you that, people think change from Biden to Trump, but I would urge people to look at the first Trump administration. The Department of Justice was completely AWOL in the effort on immigration enforcement. Completely AWOL. So now as was the Department of Defense, as was the Department of State. We've already had a Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, visit other countries in the Western Hemisphere. I'm not sure that ever happened in the first Trump administration, and raise the immigration issue with them. The Secretary of Defense has gone to the border and said whatever the president wants to close this border, he gets. I'm telling you, the Department of Defense in the first Trump administration resisted that. They fought the president like crazy internally, not publicly. None of them ever went to the border. And now we have an attorney general, the most important person in the administration as it relates to immigration enforcement, who, as you noted, has come flying out of the box. And you're right, Pam and I served as state AGs together. I was the attorney general in Virginia while she was the attorney general in Florida, and we partnered up quite a bit. And here she goes, running right out of the box, pursuing the president's agenda. And I have to say, it is refreshing to see an entire cabinet team that actually supports the president. He didn't have that in the first term.
Well, if you think about it, try to put the shoe on the other foot here for a second. Let's just say that there's a Republican state. Let's take the state of Utah. That's a ruby red state. And let's say there's a Democratic administration in Washington, and Utah says, you know what? We don't agree with the EPA. We don't agree with any of the enforcement action that they are taking. We think that goes against our values in the state of Utah, and we're not going to cooperate with the EPA. We're not going to let them into our state. We're not going to do anything that you're asking us to do, and that's just the way it's going to be. No Democratic administration would put up with that. The feds would descend into Utah from helicopters coming down from cables and take these people away.
Would. Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And of course, where you see this media standard in play is, this double standard in play is in the media. But if you look at surveys right now, the American people are with the president. They're with him on the cuts that DOJ is identifying. They're with him on enforcing border security. They're with him on mass deportations. The president is on the right side of these issues, and he ran on them. He is simply doing what he said he was going to do. And I know for Republicans in the last 35 years, we're not used to that with Republican presidents. But here we've got one who's doing exactly what he said he was going to do.
On the subject of DOGE, you come from a state where there are term limits at the state level. Your governors can only serve one term, and then they're termed out, and I think half the state is made up of former governors. But one of the things that happens when you have a governor that's elected on a platform, or any executive office, let's say, where you run on a platform and the voters say, okay, we want the state or the country to go in that direction, but everyone knows that at a certain date, at a certain time, you turn into a pumpkin due to term limits. It's real easy for the permanent bureaucracy or the administrative state or the deep state or whatever you want to call them to just say, okay, that's fine and dandy that you think that way and you want to make these changes. We're going to be here longer than you, and we're just going to wait you out, and we're not going to do anything that you want us to do. In that particular case, which I think happens all the time at various levels of government.
All the time.
You want to talk about a threat to democracy. The permanent bureaucracy is a threat to democracy if they refuse to acknowledge the will of the people when the election takes place and the results are in. And it seems like really for the first time since Reagan, and I could argue that Donald Trump is more efficiently going after the permanent bureaucracy than Ronald Reagan did. Reagan would be proud of what's going on in the country right now.
Yeah.
But this is really what he's doing by trying to rein them in is protect the will of the people, the will of the voters.
Well, again, this is something he ran on. If we could touch on a little philosophy and history here, we all learned in civics class there are three branches of government: the legislature, the executive branch, and the judiciary. But to throw a little history in there, around Woodrow Wilson's time, and he was fully supportive of this, he wanted to undermine the foundations of America. He didn't believe in the Constitution. He was very open about that. He believed experts should run things, just like the communists did at the same time. They thought experts should be in charge. And those, quote, experts are this new fourth branch of government that has grown up in the last 100 years, and it is this bureaucracy. They're called public servants because when they're doing their job correctly, they're subordinating their own will to that of the elected officials, in this case the president, because they're all in the executive branch, and they fulfill his policy goals and desires, but that is not what's happening. And they are not public servants. This is effectively a form of public welfare. They're getting paid taxpayer dollars, really our grandchildren's dollars, because we're so far in debt. And they are not the president's will, which is the entire executive branch. The entire executive branch, Article 2 of the Constitution, is one person. It's the president. And when he gets elected, the entire executive branch is to do his legal bidding. And that sounds a little bit obsequious to some people, but that's what our system is. And there's a Congress to check it and a judiciary. I said his legal bidding. And the president is absolutely within the bounds of the law to be removing so many of these folks, particularly the ones that are defying his executive orders. For example, the FEMA $59 million that was sent to New York for luxury hotels for illegal aliens after the president ordered that to cease. And Secretary Noem has correctly said, we're going to figure out who that was, and they're going to be let go. That's the way you provide accountability to a bureaucracy, and the president is bringing it. And I hope he brings it for about 3 more years and 11 months.
In a weird sort of way, could you envision a scenario where he leaves office 4 years from now and the public trust in the alphabet soup organizations actually increases? Because I can tell you, as someone who grew up revering law enforcement, looking at the FBI as an extremely professional organization that was there to do good for the country, and then after the Russia collusion hoax and everything else that we've seen come from these agencies, and it's not just the FBI, the EPA has their problems, and other aspects of government have their problems.
Well, true, but the FBI is on point on these when it comes to touching the American people and arresting, hundreds, if not thousands of people, for example, after J6. We now learn that of their 13,000 badged agents, 5,000 of them were working on J6. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? And now some folks are complaining that FBI agents are helping with mass deportation. We never got their help for anything. When I was a deputy secretary at DHS in the tail end of the Trump administration, first Trump administration, and we had cities aflame, including Portland. In Portland, we had 340 officer injuries in the summer of 2020. 340. You know how many FBI agents DOJ dispatched to help? Two. That was it. That was their contribution to law enforcement and reining in daily and nightly violence in Portland, Oregon, 2 FBI agents. But they were able to come up with 4,998 more to go after a bunch of people who police let into the Capitol. It's just mind-boggling. So yes, for longer-term vision, I can foresee cleaning these agencies up and doing it in the full light of day in such a way that when Donald Trump leaves after his second term, the Americans have more trust in them because they've been cleaned out. And it's also, of course, important for these agencies to know that they can be cleaned out. And for the folks who broke the law in there, they should be prosecuted.
As someone who was elected to statewide office with this philosophy, how difficult is it for a Republican who really wants to reform the bureaucracy to staff their agency, to staff their office, to staff their organization with people who not only share that belief, but really understand how government works? And I say that because if you grow up in a Republican family and you tell your dad, I want to go start a business, they pat you on the back and say, fantastic, that is a worthwhile pursuit. I want to go be a doctor, fantastic, go knock yourself out. If you say to your dad, I'm thinking about getting a master's degree in public administration, they look at you like you're on drugs. And so what we end up with is a lot of our people who have, I think, ideas that are very good ideas on how to rein it in. But if they understand how the government works better than our side does, that becomes a problem when you're trying to reform them.
Sure. I'll use my own experience again when I was deputy secretary of DHS. Finding right-of-center lawyers with expertise in immigration law is not easy. There's a bazillion of them who are left-wingers because they're trying to facilitate open borders. They all work for these high-paying nonprofits like ACLU and any number of alphabet soup organizations funded by the left, and apparently partly funded by USAID. I love the non-governmental organizations that are now having to shut down because they don't have USAID money. Well, if you have to shut down because you don't get government money, you aren't a non-governmental organization. You are a governmental organization. So it is interesting how many of these might disappear as DOJ continues to rove through the government, finding these outrageous expenditures and cutting them off.
We're speaking with former Virginia Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli, who's now the national chairman of the Election Transparency Initiative. Attorney General Cuccinelli, right now the state of California is trying to rebuild our homes that were burned down in the latest round of fires. The federal government and President Donald Trump is very eager to move that process along as quickly as possible. And he says that the feds are willing to come in with the Brinks truck if that's what it takes to rebuild. And the debate right now is over what strings will be attached to that money. Now, you'll find a hard time. I guess maybe the electeds themselves would fight you on this, but just people on the street, they don't mind if there are strings attached about making sure that that money goes to fire victims and doesn't go to the crooked homeless organizations and all the other groups that usually take their share of the spoils whenever money comes in from Washington, D.C. But the other strings that are currently being tossed around are strings attached to water policy that has failed the people of California, and also whether or not voter identification is something that should be required in California. In some states, it is. In California, it is not. In fact, they have pushed us to have elections that are mostly vote by mail, which is why it takes forever to count the ballots and figure out who won a close election. But Donald Trump seems to be digging in his heels on this one. Do you think that that is something that the state of California could potentially buckle on here?
It's an interesting collision, and they're so. I always think of California as given two choices, they will always do the wrong thing. So I don't see California buckling, but I certainly don't see Donald Trump buckling either. And so this money may not come. And the reality is our national government is bankrupt, and God bless him, President Trump is not terribly concerned about that, nor is anybody else in Congress. But I am, and I hope we spend less money. I think the offers to come in with the Brinks truck, they really make me cringe because we don't have any money. That's all printed money, and we need to get out of the habit of that. Much the same way he did say, look, FEMA has failed, and we need to do something different. I agree with him entirely. The federal government can't come in, swoop in on these and help out with any expertise or ability. Take a simple question like FEMA owns 2,000 mobile homes, temporary homes. Well, one, why? So where would you store them? Maybe you pick 4 sites around the country. Okay, and then there's a problem, fill in the blank, in LA. Now we've got to go get 500 trucks to bring 500 mobile homes, a couple of days drive to somewhere in the LA area where they can be set up and used. Those kinds of outside the state solutions don't work. They don't work. And if Karen Bass and if Newsom are not going to gut their own red tape and their coastal commission and just stop them from stopping people from rebuilding, those people are going to leave California, as has been happening. Governor Newsom is the only California governor since World War II to preside over a drop in population in California. How's that for a record of success?
Well, to your point about FEMA not working, if you want an example of that, all you have to look to is Maui, where you had a Democratic administration, a Democratic governor, Democratic officials elected to the state and local level at just about every layer of government. And I just spoke with the state assemblywoman who represents Lahaina, who happens to be a Democrat, by the way, who is furious and screaming at the top of her lungs that they've been ignored. And she said, I think it was 3 homes have been rebuilt, and that is it. But everything else is still just rubble, and they have them living in these temporary, I'm not even going to call it a home, but it's kind of like a container that they brought into a different part of the island, and they just say, stop complaining, it's going to take however long it takes. And that's not acceptable.
No, it's definitely not acceptable. It's pathetic, really. And especially when, that was a horrific tragedy. Not that LA isn't, but I mean, the scenes of the Hawaii situation were apocalyptic, and people being driven into the ocean to save themselves. And I point to Ron DeSantis. This isn't partisan. You mentioned Democrats had political control literally from the presidency right down to the street corner in the Hawaii situation. So it wasn't a question of political friction. But you look over at DeSantis, and one of the things he's done, he has been the best chief executive in yours and my lifetime at dealing with emergencies. And this is just skill and brain power and political will all applied to the problem intensely before it arises. So he starts with preparation. Their response is excellent and their follow-through is excellent. And no one in any state of any party has done it as well as he has during his entire governorship. And it can be done. We're Americans. We solve problems. And he isn't doing it well in Florida because of FEMA. He's doing it well in Florida because he's got a great team in Florida that he leads superbly in responding to these crises for the benefit of the people of Florida. It makes a difference. Competency counts, folks. Man, does it count. And it counts more in crises than any other time.
Former Virginia Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli, now the national chairman of the Election Transparency Initiative. If people want to find your organization online, Ken, how can they do that?
Transparency.org, and you can follow me on Twitter at Ken Cuccinelli. All you got to be able to do is spell Cuccinelli.
Well, that's easier to spell than Villaraigosa.
I tell people it's phonetic in South Italy.
Thank you so much for stopping by. Always a pleasure.
My pleasure. Good to be with you all.
Right now, it's time for KABC Dependable Traffic. And we continue at 2:35 in the afternoon. Talk Radio 790, KABC, The John Phillips Show. It is our pleasure to welcome our next guest to the program. He is the editor of the Guss Report, Daniel Guss. Welcome.
Hey, John and Randy. Thanks for having me back.
Well, thanks for coming. So let's start out by talking about this big tabloid story that is all over Los Angeles today. And that, of course, is the divorce of former L.A. Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa. He is getting divorced yet again. Gus, is this an amicable divorce, or are we talking the War of the Roses here?
I think anybody who can separate themselves from Antonio Villaraigosa has got to be happy with whatever they get. So, but apparently, it looks like it's amicable. She's getting a big lump sum of, I think, like $500,000, and there's some other arrangements. And he keeps his social media and Netflix account, and they all keep their respective artwork. I think that's pretty good. What did Antonio used to say? Like, he's a lover, not a fighter, but he's loving everybody that's around him. So I wish them all well. But who the hell would be married to Antonio Villaraigosa in his 70s anyway?
Well, you mentioned Netflix as something that was given to him in the divorce. Is a Netflix account something that a couple fights over in a divorce typically?
You know, maybe there's some sort of mayoral account or certain perks that they get. I was under the impression that everybody could have their own, but in the world of Antonio Villaraigosa, where he selected each news gal across the city when he was mayor, who the heck knows what the lifestyles of the Villarraigosas really gets somebody these days?
Well, if he likes newscasters, maybe he's got a new one in mind. Maybe he's knocking at Rachel Maddow's door. I don't know.
Oh, God, man. I don't have a comeback for that. I'm finally at a loss for words.
Well, the fact that he won't give her his name leads me to believe that he is in as a candidate for governor of California. Because if he doesn't want her running around calling herself Villaraigosa, then he plans on either getting married again or he wants to run for governor without having any excess baggage out there.
Yeah, but isn't that kind of ironic? Villaraigosa is a fabricated last name. It's not even his. He was Antonio Villar, and she was Corinna Ragosa. It's as manufactured as my last name, which my family got when we arrived on Ellis Island. So I guess it's a brand that he values. It certainly has name recognition, but I don't think it's a really good selling point in California, at least not in Los Angeles. I mean, this is a guy who couldn't take a poll, conduct a poll in the friendly confines of a DNC convention about, 10 years or so ago. So I guess if it's amicable, but he's holding on to the name, which isn't his, then he's delusional about his brand.
What kind of statewide candidate do you think he's going to make? Because when I've listened to interviews that he's given to local news channels recently, he doesn't sound like the old Antonio Villaraigosa. He sounds like Antonio's dad. He's lost a step or two. He sounds like he's confused. He takes forever to make a point. He's not the old Antonio Villaraigosa.
That's actually a good thing if he's not the old Antonio Villaraigosa. I mean, that's a positive thing. But what kind of a candidate would he be? That's a really low bar when we're talking about possibly or probably Kamala Harris or any of these retreads that we keep bringing back. Jerry Brown, God, decades after he was originally governor. So it's a low bar. He might know what to say, and it really depends less on him and more how the media portrays him. because if we get a Godzilla like a Rick Caruso running, although I think you made a point recently about him maybe considering another run at mayor of Los Angeles. Please, Rick Caruso, do that. But the portfolio would have to expand. So who's going to be in the field will really depend on how Antonio does. But he's got a pretty low bar to begin with.
Well, and Rob Bonta, the Attorney General, who thought he was going to be running for governor, announced that he is going to be running for re-election instead. And the answer that he gave, which may not be the truth, because we know that his big-time campaign contributors up in Oakland have the FBI knocking at their door, so it might have something to do with that. But his official explanation was essentially that he thought that Kamala Harris was going to jump in the race, and if she jumps in, then she's going to clear the field because she has high name ID. Democrats like her. There's no way any other Democrat is going to beat her, so why go bang your head up against the wall? If you're Rob Bonta, then maybe that makes sense if you believe that's going to happen because you're young enough where you can just wait another turn, especially if you don't think she's going to be there a full 4 years or a full 8 years and just run the next time or the time after that. If you're Antonio Villaraigosa and you're in your 70s and she gets in and expects everyone else to jump out, there is no next time. You can't wait another turn. You can't wait 4 years or 8 years because you may not have your health. You may look and sound older. That may not be appealing to voters. It's now or never. I'm not necessarily convinced if she jumps in that he runs for the hills. He may figure, all right, let's go ahead and take her on. We know she's got 1,000,001 faults. Let's see how well we can do.
You know, my mind is spinning at the prospect of a debate between Kamala Harris and Antonio Villaraigosa. I mean, John, Randy, can you run? I mean, for God's sake, somebody? Luis is a great guy, by the way. Your producer behind the scenes. Can Luis run? Because I would vote for him over either of them and just about anybody else that might be offered. It boggles the mind to debate potentially between, or I call him Viagra Sosa, and Kamala Harris. It's just mind-boggling, guys.
We're speaking with Daniel Guss, the editor of the Guss Report. Daniel, whenever current California governor, Gavin Newsom, comes down to survey the fire damage, I've noticed of late he's going to Altadena and spending a lot of time over there with Catherine Barger, and he's not going to Pacific Palisades and spending time with Karen Bass because, as we know, Pacific Palisades is in the city limits of Los Angeles, so Karen Bass is the mayor. Altadena is outside the Los Angeles city limits, so she is not the mayor and has no jurisdiction over anything that goes on there. Gavin is pictured at these press conferences with Catherine Barger and other officials within the fire department and elsewhere. You don't see many pictures of him with Karen Bass. Is that, do you believe, by accident or by design?
There is nothing that Gavin Newsom does that's by accident. Nothing. There is nothing left to chance. Everything is pre-decided, pre-configured, pre-discussed. Of course, nobody wants to be seen with Karen Bass. Nobody. Why would you? She's the scourge of the entire United States right now. She has virtually zero chance to win re-election in Los Angeles. And when you're the incumbent and you're going to be a one-term office holder, like one-term mayor of Los Angeles, that is like a bug repellent. It's like peppermint spray is to cockroaches. Pardon the analogy. I don't know where I came up with that. But being seen with Karen Bass for any other politician right now is repellent. It's not a good thing. In the same way, who the heck wants to be photographed with Gavin Newsom or Kamala Harris? So, yeah, it's by design. But if Gavin is under the impression that he's going to go against the likely successor to Trump, who will be J.D. Vance, more than likely, when he's like 8 years out of office, he's nuts. I don't see where Gavin goes from here. And other than just for maybe a TV gig or something like that, I have no idea why he is down here because I don't know where he goes after he's termed out.
What do you make of this scandal being the first big local story, the first big local scandal that has taken place since the owner of the Los Angeles Times, Patrick Soon-Shiong, has been apparently red-pilled? That paper used to carry the water for the local electeds and essentially take the storyline that they wanted out there and make that the dominant storyline in the region, which would give them a certain amount of political cover. But now that the owner has certainly gone in a totally different direction, and the paper, the writers, the columnists, the editorials, different pieces that come from that paper don't necessarily fall in line with his worldview, but you can already see changes over there in terms of what the photographs are, what the headlines are, the fact that they acknowledge reality in certain cases. And Karen Bass has not been the beneficiary of a friendly newspaper with this story. The newspaper has been critical of her performance. How much does that factor into how poorly the public thinks that she's done?
Well, I think she's done her whatever, and she's Antonio Villaraigosa's age also. I think she's 71, about to turn 72. No, I think Karen Bass's predicament is self-induced, and it's bolstered by an incompetent, corrupt government at the city and county and state level. The fact that the LA Times is catching up to reality now, it's nice to see. And by the way, every single time, and you and I have discussed this, every single time that I see Patrick Soon-Shiong, the owner of the LA Times, make statements about his new vision for the paper, I am really cheering the guy on. He sounds like a very level-headed executive, and I think that he sounds like maybe the most pragmatic person at the paper, and it's good to be king. He sounds like the voice of reason, but the LA Times still has a way to go. But for the paper's new perspective about Bass, I think it's new and it's good to see, but her problems are self-induced, and they don't come as any surprise to me because she kind of cultivated this. And yes, she inherited a bad situation from Garcetti, but you're supposed to play the hand that you're dealt, and she played it as bad as possible. So good to the LA Times, but they have a lot more to do to being fair and balanced.
Do we know what happened with him? Why all of a sudden, after owning the paper for years, where he was essentially a passive voice, he wasn't involved in the editorial decisions of that paper, he has now decided to assert himself. Do we know if there was a specific event that caused him to do that?
If there was, I'm not aware of it, but it's possible that he saw that he was losing money hand over fist and has been for a long time. And, you know, he's worth like $8 billion, which is magnificent, but it's not Jeff Bezos money. It's not Elon Musk money. He has pocket change compared to what they have. And so after a number of years, and he's owned part or all of the Times for a good number of years now, he may be being a medical doctor and a scientist himself. He may be saying, you know, something's not working here. It's not just that the print newspaper industry is dying and it needs to be revised. I would like to think that he's done some real deep soul searching, maybe had consultants. But in terms of whether there was an event, I'm not aware of it. I know that his daughter has brought a lot of controversy to the paper, as if it didn't have enough problems already. But I think it was more a business decision, and him, reading the room that it's not working, and being a pragmatic sounding guy. He said, you know what, we don't have any balance here. But if it was a specific event, I'm not aware of it.
Daniel Guss, editor of the Guss Report. Daniel, thanks so much for stopping by. Always a pleasure.
Anytime, guys. You have a great day now.
Right now, it's time for KABC Dependable Traffic.